So, now I am pleased to introduce the next speaker, which is Ole Røgeberg. The first time I met Ole, it was at a dinner party after a dissertation for a mutual friend, and the first thing he said to me, so he was like, okay, my name is Ole, and I do research within the field of drugs. So all of the rest of the dinner party had to all of the participants were like, okay, so I'm a DJ. And I was like, yeah, so I'm a social worker within the field of drugs as well. But I thought that was kind of like a good icebreaker. Ole is known to always say yes. He has been part of every Nordic Reform Conference, as he is this year as well. Ole is a senior research fellow, deputy director at the Frisch Centre in Oslo. His past research covers sickness, absence, traffic crash studies, the regulation of drugs, economic theories of addiction, and IQ. He has also been an active participant in the Norwegian drug policy debate. And we are so pleased that you are here again to share your knowledge about criminalization and the effect on help-seeking behavior. So welcome up on stage.
Let's see, do I have something to move the slides with? Or how does that work? Okay, let's try that. So, I was invited to talk about whether criminalization affects help-seeking behavior. And unfortunately, I can't speak directly to that. Next. Yes. So, what I'll be talking about instead is something closely related, which is this article, which was published in the Journal of the Norwegian Medical Association and which was translated into English earlier this week, which presents the results from a survey of help-seeking behavior among illegal substance users. And that's not exactly the same thing, because we can't really say anything about the effects of criminalization, because we only observe people who are, we have the survey responses from people who are living in a system where things are criminalized, and we don't really know what it would be like if it was not criminalized. But at least we can say something about these people, and we can say something that may not have been said before. Next. So there's going to be like a lot of nexts now, I noticed, because I have like each sentence comes, so I'll just, next. Okay, so one of the problems is that we know that only a subset of the people who have a substance use disorder actually seek treatment. And that's not just when there's an illegal drug involved, it's in general. Mental health problems are often not dealt with a doctor, and especially so if it has to do with substance use. Next. Yeah, and there's a common view that criminalization of use contributes to this. And it's often said, you see that in articles, but there's quite limited information about it. Next. In the Norwegian debate, one of the things that was pointed out was that this one? Okay, let's try that. So one of the things that was pointed out in the Norwegian debate is that if a study that had looked at overdose deaths found that the majority of them, around 80%, had been in contact with health or social care services in the previous year. It wasn't broken down on health, but at least that made it seem like these people were more in touch with health services than you would have imagined. Less, however, is known about the low-frequency users and those with more controlled use. And the main challenge is that there's a lack of data, because this is a hidden population, and they're characterized by the fact that they're doing an illegal activity as something that they would be punished if they were caught. They're not identifiable in administrative registers, so often that's where we in Norway will find information about people. But if you haven't been open about your use and you haven't been caught by the police, we can't see that you are a drug user in the data. And when we do general population surveys, this group is so small that you just get a few of them, and you can't really talk about the patterns of use in that very small group, because it might be just like 5 or 10 people out of a sample of 500 that fit into this group. So this study came about in an interesting way. There was a web survey that was initiated by the Association for Safer Drug Policy, who are arranging this conference today. And they recruited people through a safer use harm reduction website. So they designed the survey, and when you came onto this website looking for information, there was a pop-up, and it asked whether you wanted to participate in this survey. And then additionally, they sent out a link to the survey through various channels that went to people in various drug user organizations, forums, social forums on the internet, and so on. But we have not analyzed those. The main focus of the questions was whether you were open about your illegal drug use with family, with friends, and with health personnel. And also what kind of help-seeking behavior you had when you thought you needed help with a substance use issue, when you had been a victim of a crime, or when you had been witness to an acute drug-related health problem. And this data material was then made available for research purposes for Ville Pedersen, a professor of sociology, and myself, with no costs and no strings attached. And it was a very interesting material. So what we use here, we use only the participants recruited from this Safer Use website. And we use only participants who self-report ever having used illegal drugs. But that gives us a sample, nonetheless, of 2,500 people, which is a lot. So there was a similar Swedish study used, and they had a sample which totaled about 1,200. So this is a bigger sample, and that makes it possible to look at the patterns here. And what I'm going to look at, what we looked at in this article in particular, is health-related help-seeking behavior and openness towards the health personnel. So this is not a representative sample. That's important to note. But nonetheless, it's a big sample. There's 70% of them are male, and we know that males are overrepresented in illegal drug use. It has an age profile where you see that most people are between the ages of 18 and 34, which seems reasonable. The age profile seems to be more or less what you would expect. They look like they might be frequent users. So you can see that about 45–50% say that they've used, that is less than 1 week since the last time they used a drug. However, it could also be theoretically possible that people go on this website right after having used the drug because they've experienced something they were a bit unsure about. So that might be also the reason for the frequency, but you can also see that 1 to 4 weeks, 1 to 3 months, there's a tapering off, but it seems that this is a group that use drugs relatively frequently. Most of them are working or in education, so there's about 40%, both males and females, that are students, and around the same level that are employed, either part-time or full-time or self-employed. The majority full-time. And few of them, and this is important, few of them have been in contact with the police. So there's about 10%, if you look across the genders there, that have been both caught and punished by the police. And then there's some people that have been caught but not punished, but the majority, around 80% of both sexes, have never been caught or punished by the police. So this is a group that you would typically not be able to get data on, which makes it quite interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tell you the questions that we posed so that you can see exactly what people answered. And here they asked, have you ever told a doctor, psychologist, or other healthcare, social care professional that you have used illegal substances? With a follow-up question, did you get the help you needed after you disclosed this? And did you experience any negative consequences after disclosing your substance use? And here are the results. So about 40% have told healthcare or social care worker that they have used illegal drugs, but 60% have not. And if we zero in on these 40% who have told, we can see that when we asked them whether they received the relevant help, about 60% said that they didn't really need any help. And the others are split quite evenly between yes and no. So it seems that the people who did need help, about half of them received the help. And if you look at negative consequences of having been open, The majority here say no, but there is a substantial minority of about 25% who say that this had negative consequences. And when there's a follow-up question where people can write down what it was these problems were, and these are something that we're hoping to analyze in a later study. But just looking at it, there are some themes that do not have to do with criminalization, things that they hadn't admitted to themselves that they had these problems, or they just tried to avoid the issue. And then there are other things that are quite closely related to criminalization, people who are afraid of this becoming a police matter, or that this could make them lose their driver's license in particular. These are some of the things that are mentioned. A different question asks whether they have ever avoided telling a doctor, psychologist, or other healthcare social care professional about their drug use when it was relevant. So this is more specifically, have you kept this information away even when it should have been told? And have you ever avoided or postponed seeking treatment even though you thought you needed treatment? So here's about 40% say that they have not been open when it has been relevant. And when you look at the avoided, postponed treatment, the majority, about 80%, say that they haven't really felt the need for treatment. And if you just focus on this last group here, these two who have in some way had a need for treatment, it looks like about 2/3 of those did not receive the treatment. They avoided or postponed treatment when they needed it. So these are people who felt the need for treatment, and about 2/3 of them have avoided or postponed treatment. And when we look at, again, we have the open text answers, which we haven't analyzed fully, but some of the topics that come up there are things that have to do with stigmatization, that people are afraid that if they admit to illegal drug use, that's going to define them, and every other problem is going to be seen through that lens. So, some people might say that, it's a sort of taking this to the extreme, that you'll come in with a broken leg and they'll be like, yes, but you're a drug user, and what you need to stop using your drugs first. That this becomes like the overarching thing that people focus on. And also that it might have problems they cause problems with their jobs, or again, with the driver's license. The final topic that I'm going to talk about has to do with acute situations, where we ask how many times have you been in a situation where someone overdosed, became psychotic, had another serious worrying reaction, or was seriously injured after taking an illegal substance. The follow-up question, have you ever in such an event experienced that an ambulance was not called, or that you waited to call an ambulance, even though you thought that the person needed immediate help? And what reasons, if any, were given for not calling an ambulance? Now, 60% had never experienced an acute situation of this kind. And then there's a tapering off. Some people have experienced it once, some people have experienced it multiple times. And later we're going to look at how, in a later study, we're hoping to look at how these patterns have to do with age and your background. But for now, this is what we have. So if you this is the group that have experienced it, and these are the people who were asked how people responded and whether help was called. And 40% say that the ambulance was not called. And 10% say that it was delayed. And then you have 20% who said that it was always called, and some people who are unsure. And these, the people, when you look, again, we have the open text responses that we can look at. But here there are also some different alternatives that people could select that could inform us about what kind of, some of the hypotheses that the people who designed this survey had regarding what kind of factors stop people, which I show you here. So the most prevalent of these are the 4 categories that people could say whether they were irrelevant, very low relevance, highly relevant, etc. And you can see that 73% said that it was highly or quite relevant, that there was a concern for police involvement. People were afraid. It was either, it could be because some other people had drugs there, and they were afraid that those were going to be caught, or that everyone had been using drugs. And in one case, there was the person who had the acute reaction had actually had that on alcohol, and they write that the person was taken outside and away from the party because everyone else at the party had used illegal drugs, and they were very afraid of the police getting into that space. Concern for other government offices, this can be things like social care services, NAV, and then ambulance seen as unnecessary, and a concern that parents or guardians would be involved. And you'll see that these sum up to more than 100%. And that's because these are the topics that came up in a discussion. And I would guess a lot of these situations are a bit chaotic. There's a lot of people, suddenly something happens to someone, and one person says, we need to call an ambulance, and freaks out, and another person says, no, don't, you can't call, the police will come. And then there's different arguments being made and different voices, and then something comes out of that. But these are the different, that's why you'll see more than one, more than 100% in total. So what do we learn from this? Well, one thing from a scientific perspective is that we learned that this rusopplysning and this harm reduction, safer use website is a very good recruiting tool for getting access to the population that we rarely have a direct way of getting in touch with in other ways. So there are studies of people who have used illegal drugs in a sort of hospitality venue, in a pub or somewhere. You have the same thing in music festivals. But people who use this in private, it's difficult to get a hold of them, and this is a good source for doing that. And there's a mixed picture with regard to openness. About 4 in 10 had been open to health and social care personnel, and the majority of these, even though they did not feel a need for treatment for these issues. However, also, 1 in 5 of these people had experienced negative consequences, either with their job or with driver's license or the police, or with the way they were then later treated. So one person says that this became a part of my, the doctor has this what's it called, your file, your patient file. So it enters the patient file, and they said that even though this was long ago, it was still something that it was more difficult to get medicines that they needed for various conditions, because there was the suspicion that, but we know that you were a drug user, even though it might have been a short period of their life or even a substance that is not really relevant for the later medication. Also, 1/3 of the sample had avoided sharing information even when they felt that it had been relevant. And a majority of those who had felt that they needed treatment for drug use had either avoided or postponed such treatment. Now, this does not necessarily mean that it's because of criminalization. Like, some of these people said that, of course I postponed it because you don't want to admit this. You're trying to, ignore this issue that you're aware that you have it at some level, but you don't really want to deal with it. It's difficult. So that's one part of it. But then there's also the criminalization. And balancing those two and knowing which one is the important one is difficult to know. And about 16% of the full sample had witnessed at least one acute episode where an ambulance was not called. So criminalization is plausibly related to this, but we can't really say that, it is criminalization that is driving this. There's some hypothetical questions where people are asked, would they be more open with the doctor? Would they call an ambulance in similar situations if there were no legal repercussions for use? And a lot of the people do then say that, yes, they would. They would then change their behavior. And that might be, but it could also be that the fact that it is criminalized makes that a very easy rationalization to pick up on. That there are reasons for not doing it, and the most easy to grasp reason is, the police can come, or it's illegal, we don't want to, and it could be that other reason. So it's difficult to know how predictive that hypothetical question is for what people would actually do if the laws were changed. So one thing that we might want to have in a later study, if this was repeated, is to have what you could call decriminalized controls. For instance, alcohol users who are of a similar age and similar type, and see to what extent have they experienced similar problems, and to what extent did they seek help when they had a problem with alcohol abuse or dependence. And also in this paper that we have here, we have not used the hypothetical questions so far, although we will use them in the future. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Ole. We're going to have a brief Q&A while they're putting some chairs up here for the next session. But I got a question here from Slido to you. Why did you exclude the respondents recruited through social media for the study?
Okay, so we did that in this study, but we're going to look at those in later research. And the reason was that it was easier to characterize. The majority of the answers that came into the survey came from the rusopplysningen.no. And that means that we can sort of, this is a group that is, we know that there are people who use drugs and they're interested in reading about the effects, they're interested in safe use and harm reduction. It's easy to characterize that sample, whereas some of the other sources of information had more specifics or user populations that were being recruited into it, which might be, mixing those two together, you get something different. And we just wanted to have something that was more easily interpretable in this case.
Okay, thank you. Are the results of this survey in line with other research on the effect of criminalization on help-seeking behavior, as you know?
So there's we haven't found a lot of studies on this topic, but we found a Swedish study that I mentioned that had about 1,200 respondents that they had recruited from an online drug discussion forum, and they found quite similar results. They asked in particular about whether people would call help if there was an acute situation, and found that about 31% said they would be hesitant to do it. They would probably avoid if they could, and 9% said that they would never do it. And then the rest said that, they would call. And that sums up to 40%, which is quite similar to what we saw in this study here.
Mm-hmm. And we take one more question here. Do you see any avenues for further research on this topic?
Yeah, well, I think, so one thing I would like to do, and that we're thinking about doing with this material, is to try and look at more of the patterns in the data. So we have some people who are quite young. They've probably not experienced as many of these acute episodes, for instance, and to look at how these responses vary over the groups and over the people who come from these different other recruitment sources. The people who were recruited by the Association for Humane Drug Policies, Normal, Freak Forum, and see how things differ. That's the first thing we're going to do, we hope.
Yeah. Thank you. Give him a big applause.